In a world saturated with products, pitches, and promises, attention has become the rarest currency of all. Startups do not fail because they lack technology. They fail because no one listens long enough to understand why that technology matters. This is where storytelling enters, not as decoration, but as survival. The most successful startups are not always the most advanced. They are the most understood, and understanding begins with story. Books on entrepreneurship, branding, and human behavior converge on a simple truth. People do not remember features, they remember meaning. A startup can explain what it does in a sentence, yet fail to explain why it exists. Storytelling bridges that gap. It transforms a product into a narrative, a solution into a journey, and a company into a character people can root for. Without story, even the best ideas remain invisible. In the early stages, founders often believe that clarity alone is enough. If they just explain the product well, attention will follow. But clarity without context rarely persuades. Story provides context. It answers unspoken questions. Why now? Why you? Why should I care? Books that analyze iconic startups show that attention is not captured by information, but by tension, the contrast between the world as it is and the world as it could be. Great startup stories live in that gap. At its core, storytelling is about framing struggle. Every meaningful startup story begins with a problem that feels personal, urgent, and unresolved. Airbnb was not about renting rooms, it was about belonging. Stripe was not about payments, it was about removing friction for builders. These companies did not lead with what they built, they led with what was broken. The books emphasize this repeatedly. Attention is drawn to pain before it is drawn to promise. Another critical insight from storytelling literature is that startups are not the heroes of their stories. The customer is. Startups that center themselves as protagonists often sound self-absorbed. Those that position the user as the hero and the product as the guide create resonance. This narrative structure, echoed in books on marketing and myth, allows audiences to see themselves in the story. Attention deepens when people feel included, not impressed. Storytelling also gives coherence to complexity. Startups operate in uncertain, evolving environments. Products change. Markets shift. Strategies adapt. Without story, these changes feel chaotic. With story, they feel intentional. Books show that storytelling acts as a through line, allowing startups to evolve without confusing their audience. The story stays stable even as the tactics change. Another overlooked power of storytelling is internal alignment. Founders often think of story as external, something for customers or investors. But the strongest startups use story to align teams. A shared narrative clarifies priorities. It helps employees understand not just what they are building, but why it matters. When trade-offs arise, story becomes a decision-making filter. This internal clarity translates into external confidence. Attention is also shaped by authenticity. Modern audiences are highly sensitive to manufactured narratives. Books on contemporary branding warn that storytelling is not about inventing drama, it is about articulating truth with intention. The most compelling startup stories are grounded in real experiences, real failures, real learning. Vulnerability, when used honestly, builds trust faster than perfection ever could. Another theme that emerges strongly is consistency. Storytelling is not a one-time pitch. It is a repeated signal. Every landing page, demo, support interaction, and update either reinforces or erodes the story. Startups that capture attention over time are those whose narratives remain coherent across touchpoints. The books describe this as narrative integrity. When actions match words, attention turns into loyalty. Storytelling also plays a decisive role in fundraising. Investors hear hundreds of pitches that sound identical. Metrics blur together. Slides blend into noise. What stands out is narrative clarity. Not exaggeration, but perspective. The ability to place numbers inside a story of progress, learning, and momentum. Books on venture capital emphasize that investors back trajectories, not snapshots. Story provides the arc that makes a trajectory visible. As startups grow, storytelling evolves. Early stories focus on survival and possibility. Later stories focus on impact and responsibility. The books show that companies that fail to evolve their narrative risk being trapped by their past. What once sounded bold may later sound naive. Effective storytellers update the story without betraying its core. This balance between continuity and growth is what keeps attention alive over time. Perhaps the most profound insight is that storytelling is not manipulation, it is sense-making. Startups operate on the edge of the unknown. Customers, employees, and investors all feel uncertainty. Story does not remove that uncertainty, but it makes it navigable. It provides a mental map. Books argue that people follow stories not because they guarantee success, but because they make participation feel meaningful. As these ideas accumulate, storytelling reveals itself not as a marketing skill, but as a leadership discipline. Founders who tell clear stories think clearly. They see patterns. They communicate priorities. They attract believers rather than skeptics. Attention, in this sense, is earned, not hacked. And this is where the story begins to deepen. Because once startups understand that attention is captured not by shouting louder, but by speaking more clearly, the question shifts. It is no longer, how do we get noticed, but what story are people actually hearing when they encounter us? It is at this point where intention meets perception, that storytelling becomes a strategic lever, shaping trust, momentum, and belief, and setting the stage for how attention turns into adoption, adoption into advocacy, and advocacy into lasting growth, unfolding naturally, almost invisibly, like a current pulling people forward before they realize they've chosen to follow. And this is where storytelling in startups reaches its most consequential phase, not in capturing attention, but in holding it long enough for belief to form. In the second half of the storytelling journey, the books become very clear about one thing. Attention is fleeting, but trust is earned through repetition. A single compelling story can open a door, but only consistency keeps it open. Startups that truly master storytelling understand that every interaction is a chapter in the same narrative. When the story fragments, attention dissolves. When the story coheres, attention deepens into commitment. One of the most important lessons emphasized in startup literature is that stories must evolve without breaking. Early-stage storytelling often centers on possibility, what could be different, what might exist. As traction grows, the story must shift toward proof. Evidence replaces imagination. Outcomes replace intention. Startups that fail to evolve their narrative often sound stuck in the past, repeating promises that no longer match reality. Those that succeed allow the story to mature, showing growth without abandoning the original why. Another critical insight is that storytelling shapes perception long before logic engages. People decide how to feel about a startup before they decide what to think. Books on behavioral psychology and branding repeatedly show that emotion precedes analysis. Storytelling sets the emotional frame. When the frame is right, details reinforce belief. When the frame is wrong, even strong evidence struggles to land. This is why startups that capture attention early often find it easier to explain complexity later. As companies scale, storytelling also becomes a tool for resilience. Markets shift, products stumble, crises emerge. In these moments, Startups without a clear narrative appear reactive, even panicked. Those with a strong story appear adaptive. The books highlight that storytelling during adversity is not about spin, it is about coherence, explaining what is happening, why it matters, and how it fits the larger journey preserves trust when certainty disappears. Another subtle but powerful theme emerges around silence. Not every story needs to be told loudly. The most confident startups learn when not to speak. They allow users to tell the story for them. Testimonials, word of mouth, organic advocacy. These are extensions of storytelling that feel more credible because they are not controlled. Books emphasize that when customers repeat your story in their own words, attention transforms into momentum. Storytelling also acts as a filter. Not everyone is meant to follow every startup. Clear stories repel as much as they attract. This is a strength, not a weakness. Startups that try to appeal to everyone dilute meaning. Those that tell specific stories attract aligned users, employees, and investors. The books argue that focus in storytelling is a strategic advantage. Clarity sharpens attention. Vagueness numbs it. As the narrative matures, storytelling begins to influence ethics and responsibility. Startups that grow large carry cultural weight. Their stories shape expectations, behaviors, and norms. The books caution that careless narratives, glorifying hustle at all costs, disruption without consequence, growth without accountability, eventually backfire. Responsible storytelling acknowledges impact. It recognizes trade-offs. It treats success as stewardship rather than entitlement. Eventually, the most powerful startups reach a point where storytelling no longer feels like something they do. It feels like something they are. The narrative is embedded in the product, the culture, and the way decisions are made. New hires absorb it intuitively. Users sense it immediately. The story becomes self-reinforcing, requiring less effort to maintain because it is lived rather than performed. This is the quiet ending the books arrive at. Storytelling does not replace substance, it reveals it. When a startup's actions and story align, attention stops being something chased and becomes something granted. People lean in not because they are persuaded, but because they are aligned. If this reflection resonated with you, pause and ask yourself one question. If someone described your startup's story without using your words, would you recognize it as true? Share that thought. And if you want to continue exploring how clarity, narrative, and meaning quietly outperform noise in the startup world, stay connected. Subscribe, follow, and return. Because the most powerful stories are not the loudest, they are the ones people choose to carry forward.